There was a place on the south coast of Wales where 50 nations lived as neighbours. Sailors from Somalia and Norway, from Yemen and the West Indies and the coast of West Africa, crowded into a single square mile of dockland where the coal of an empire was loaded onto the ships of the world. They called it Tiger Bay. And for 100 years it was the wildest, most notorious corner of Britain, a place of gambling dens and opium rooms, of shebeens and dance halls and brothels, of music that spilled out of the doorways and never seemed to stop. It survived the death of King Cole, it survived the bombs of the Blitz, it even survived a clearance that flattened its streets to rubble, but it did not survive a single government deal, and today the name itself is gone. This is the story of how Britain erased its most extraordinary community, not with war, not with fire, but with a signature, a barrage and a rebrand. To understand what was lost, you have to begin with what was never supposed to be there at all. Because Tiger Bay was not ancient, it was not some medieval settlement with roots deep in the soil. The land it stood on was tidal marsh, empty moors that flooded with the sea twice a day, the kind of ground nobody wanted and nobody lived on. It took one man's gamble to change that. His name was John Crichton Stuart, the second Marquess of Bute, and he was Cardiff's foremost landowner. In the early decades of the 19th century, he bet his fortune on the coal beneath the Welsh valleys, and he built a dock on the empty moors south of the small town of Cardiff to ship it out. The West Bute dock opened in October of 1839. The canal from Merthyr had already been cut. The railway from the valleys followed soon after, and the coal began to move. It came down from the Rhondda and the Cynon, black and endless, and it went out across the oceans. The first to settle the new dockland were not exotic strangers, but Welsh mariners from the fishing villages of the west. And then the Irish, fleeing famine, shipped across the water, almost like human ballast, to dig the docks they would live beside. A community began to grow on the reclaimed mud, a community barely a generation old, with no memory of a time before the ships. Even its name was an accident of the sea. There is a romantic story that Tiger Bay was named for the fierce, tiger-like currents of the Severn estuary, or by Portuguese sailors who compared the treacherous approach to the spring of a tiger. It is a lovely story. But the more careful research points somewhere darker and more honest. The name was sailors' slang, carried over from the dockside slums of London's East End, where Tiger Bay already meant a place of vice and danger. It was never a name the people chose for themselves. It was a label pinned on them by outsiders, and it first appears in the crime reports of the 1880s. The people who lived there simply called it the Docks or Bute Town. The world would call it Tiger Bay, and the world had reason to look, because by the time that name took hold, Cardiff had become something staggering. From the 1880s onward, the port was handling more coal than any other harbour on earth. The town that had been one of the smallest in Wales became the largest, and at the very heart of it stood a building that, for a few decades, ruled the price of coal across the planet. The coal exchange opened in Mount Stuart Square in the 1880s, a great hall of dark wood and high galleries. Each day the ship owners and coal masters and brokers met on its trading floor, as many as 200 men shouting and gesturing at the midday peak, while the price of the world's fuel was struck by word of mouth and by telephone. It is said that the first £1 million deal in history was sealed inside those walls. The figures rose year after year, and they reached their summit in 1913, when 10.7 million tonnes of coal were shipped out of Cardiff in a single year. There is a quiet irony in that date. 1913 was the peak. It was also the last full year of the world that built Tiger Bay. The very next summer, the lamps would go out across Europe, and the long, slow decline of the coal age would begin. But nobody on the trading floor knew that yet. To them, the boom would last forever. They built monuments to their certainty. The Pierhead building rose at the water's edge in 1897. Red terracotta and a clock tower, the locals nicknamed the Welsh Big Ben, the proud headquarters of the company that owned the docks. It still stands today, one of the few survivors, watching over a bay its builders would not recognise. But the true wealth of Tiger Bay was never really in the coal or the buildings, it was in the people, and there had never been people quite like them anywhere in Britain. By the outbreak of the First World War, sailors and workers from more than 50 different nations had made their homes in this one small district. Somalis and Yemenis, Greeks and Norwegians, men from the West Indies and West Africa, from Malta and Portugal and Spain and China and Italy and Ireland, all living in the streets around Bute Street, marrying one another, raising mixed families together, building Wales's oldest and most diverse community on the reclaimed marsh. By 1911, the black and Asian population of Cardiff was second in all of Britain only to London's. A government record would later call it simply Wales's oldest multi-ethnic community. The people who lived there had a better phrase. One woman said the League of Nations could have learned a thing or two from Tiger Bay. And here is the heart of the misunderstanding that would one day be used to destroy it. Because there were two Tiger Bays, and which one you saw depended entirely on where you stood. To the outsider, to the newspaper reporter, and the respectable citizen up in the city, Tiger Bay was sin made visible. It was the red light district of the empire, a warren of pubs and gambling houses and opium dens, of all-night drinking and dancing, and women working the dockside. There were said to be more than 20 pubs on Bute Street alone, with names that told you everything, and a couple of rougher dens that men called the Bucket of Blood and the Snake Pit. To the city above, it was a place of moral danger, somewhere decent people did not go. But to the people who actually lived there, that reputation was a slander stretched over something precious. They remembered streets where the doors were left unlocked, a sisterhood of women who raised one another's children while the men were away at sea for months on end, calypso and jazz and the steel pan drifting between the houses, a place where a Yemeni sailor and his Welsh wife could run a cafe that was also a boarding house and also a mosque, all at once, and nobody thought it strange. The vice was real, but it was mostly confined to a few streets that were not even truly part of the bay. The community was real too, and it was the larger truth. Nowhere is that truth written more powerfully than in a single night of the war. The Muslim community of Tiger Bay, founded by Somali and Yemeni seafarers back in the 1800s, had built something remarkable. On Peel Street, after years of worship in converted houses, they were granted permission to raise the first purpose-built mosque in all of Wales. Then came the night of the 2nd of January 1941, the worst air raid Cardiff would suffer in the entire war. The same raid that shattered Llandaff Cathedral and killed 165 people across the city. The bomb fell on the mosque while some 30 worshippers were at prayer inside, and in the years that followed, the community simply rebuilt, raising a new mosque with a dome and a minaret on the same wounded ground. They had been bombed by the Luftwaffe, and they had endured, remember that, because the bombs could not finish Tiger Bay. Something else would. This was a community that produced people the world would never forget. In a room above a cafe on Bute Street on the 8th of January 1937, a Nigerian seaman and his English wife had their youngest daughter. They named her Shirley. Shirley Bassey would go on to become the only artist ever to record the theme to 3 James Bond films, the voice behind Goldfinger itself, a dame of the British Empire, the girl from Tiger Bay who conquered the world. She was not alone. There was Jim Driscoll, the boxer they called Peerless, born by the docks, British featherweight champion, a man so beloved that when he died young of consumption, an estimated 100,000 people lined the streets of Cardiff for his funeral. There was Billy Boston, born in the Bay to an Irish mother and a Sierra Leonean father, who would become the most prolific try scorer in the history of British Rugby League. Hold on to that name as well. We will come back to him at the very end because his story closes this one in a way nobody could have written. Because for all its warmth, Tiger Bay was never spared the cruelty of its age. In June of 1919, as servicemen came home from the war to find no work, the resentment boiled over. White crowds attacked the Yemeni, Somali and Caribbean men of the Bay, and for 3 days the violence raged. Officially 3 men died, though those who were there said the true number was higher, and in a detail that tells you everything about the justice of the time. When the police made their arrests, almost all of those they took were the victims, not the men who had started it. The people of the Bay armed themselves and defended their own streets. As one historian put it, they were tough people and they would protect what was theirs. That spirit ran deep. During the Second World War, when the authorities tried to ban black American servicemen from the city's pubs, the publicans and the locals of Tiger Bay simply refused to enforce it. They had spent half a century learning that a man's worth had nothing to do with where the sea had carried him from. The rest of the world was only beginning to catch up. But the sea that made Tiger Bay was already turning against it. The coal that had built the docks was running out of buyers. After the First World War, the trade slid, and through the depression of the 1930s it collapsed, falling year after year as the ships grew fewer. The docks fell quiet, and in 1964 the last of the coal exports ceased altogether. King Coal, who had ruled this stretch of water for 100 years, was dead. What happens to a community when the reason for its existence simply stops? The ships no longer came. Without ships there was no work, and without work there was no need for the people, and without the people there seemed, to those who governed from above, no need for the streets at all. The houses, many of them a century old, were left to decay. Damp crept in, vacancy and unemployment took hold, and the city looked down at the bay it had once grown rich upon, and it began to call it something it had wanted to call it for a very long time: a slum. And here is the part of the story that almost everyone forgets. Tiger Bay was not killed once, it was killed twice. The first killing came in the 1960s, a full generation before the famous redevelopment, and it is the wound that the survivors never stopped grieving. The city authorities had branded Butte Town a physical and moral slum, and rather than repair it street by street the way they did in neighbouring Grangetown, they decided simply to erase it. Beginning in 1960, the bulldozers came. Over the next few years they demolished 45 streets of Victorian houses and cottages. They filled in the old Glamorganshire Canal with cement. They tore out Loudon Square, which had been the very heart of the old Tiger Bay, the jewel of the place, and in its centre they raised 2 16-storey concrete tower blocks, Loudon House and Nelson House. Between 1960 and 1966, the people were decanted, that was the word the planners used, decanted, as though they were liquid to be poured from one vessel into another, scattered out to suburban estates on the edge of the city. The historian Neil Sinclair, who was born in the Bay and loved it until the day he died, remembered it with a bitterness that never faded. They wanted us gone, he said, and one way to do that was to knock it all down. The close-knit world of 50 nations, the unlocked doors, the sisterhood, the music in the streets, was severed in the space of a few years. The name Tiger Bay began to fade from the maps, replaced by the colder, more official Butte Town. The community was wounded, badly, but it was not yet finished. The deal that would finish it had not yet been struck. If you have walked with this story all the way down to here, to the very edge of the thing that ended it, take a moment to subscribe before we go on. This channel exists to remember the places Britain chose to forget, and there are far more of them than you would ever think. Now to the deal itself. It was struck in 1987, By then the bay was a desert of dereliction, around a quarter of its buildings empty, unemployment running terribly high, the old docks rotting in a sea of industrial wasteland. And in the politics of that decade, dereliction on that scale was seen not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. The government of the day had a new instrument for places like this, the Urban Development Corporation, a body armed with public money and the power to seize land, answerable not to the local council but to ministers. It had been tried in the Docklands of London, now it would come to Cardiff. The driving force was the Secretary of State for Wales, Nicholas Edwards, a man who would later take the title Lord Crickhowell. He came down from his office in the centre of the city to look at the Docklands, and what he saw appalled and inspired him in equal measure. It was a derelict desert, he recalled, and yet it was coast, it was water, and surely, he thought, people ought to be able to live and work and play down here. In 1987, he created the Cardiff Bay Development Corporation, handing it 1,100 hectares of land and a mission statement of breathtaking ambition to put Cardiff on the international map as a superlative maritime city to rival any in the world. To lead it, he appointed Sir Geoffrey Inkin, who would chair the corporation through its entire existence. The vision was grand, but it had a problem, and the problem was the sea itself. The tide in the Bristol Channel is among the highest in the world, and for much of every day it pulled back from the bay to expose hundreds of hectares of brown tidal mudflats. To the developers, those mudflats were ugly, an embarrassment, no foundation for a glittering waterfront, and so a civil servant proposed a solution of extraordinary scale. They would build a barrage, a great dam across the mouth of the bay, from the Cardiff docks across to Penarth, and they would trap the two rivers behind it to drown the mudflats forever beneath a permanent freshwater lake. This was the deal. Reclaim the wasteland, dam the sea, and build a new city on top of the old one. And almost everything about it was fought bitterly for years. The man who led the fight was Rhodri Morgan, the Labour Member of Parliament for Cardiff West, who would one day become the first Minister of Wales. On the 3rd of July, 1989, he declared his opposition, and he did not let go of it. He warned that the scheme was wrong, that it would subject his constituents to disturbance for something of extremely doubtful value. He feared the raised water would bring damp and rot and flooding to the homes nearby. He was a naturalist, and he valued the mudflats that the developers despised. For nearly 5 years he used every weapon the rules of Parliament allowed, the filibuster, the procedural delay, the long night of obstruction, holding back the barrage scheme bill by bill. And he was not alone in his objection. The mudflats were not ugly to everyone. They were a site of special scientific interest, a feeding ground within the wider Severn estuary where tens of thousands of wading birds came to feed in winter, the dunlin and the redshank probing the rich brown mud. The Royal Society for the Protection of Birds opposed the barrage. So did the official countryside body for Wales, and the most damning testimony came from the government's own side, on the floor of the House of Commons. The loss of the site of special scientific interest, a minister admitted, was an inevitable and regrettable consequence of the bill. It was a fundamental principle of the scheme, he said, that the impounded lake should permanently cover the existing mudflats. They knew exactly what they were drowning. They drowned it anyway. In the end, the opposition could only delay, not stop. When the scheme could not be forced through as one kind of legislation, the government simply reintroduced it as another and pushed it through. The Cardiff Bay Barrage Act became law in 1993. Construction began the following year, 1994, and in 1999 the barrage was closed. The rivers backed up behind it, and the bay that had been tidal for all of recorded history filled for the first time with still, flat, fresh water. The mudflats vanished. The birds in their thousands simply left, and most of them never settled anywhere else. A way of being that the land had known for thousands of years ended in a single season, behind a wall of concrete and steel. And then, on the drowned and reclaimed ground, they built the new Cardiff. It is, by any honest measure, impressive. Around 200 acres of dereliction were reclaimed. Some £1.8 billion of private money flowed in, against a total scheme cost of around £2.4 billion. Luxury apartments rose along the water by the thousand. A 5-star hotel, a marina. The old oval dock basin was filled in and reopened as a public square, later named Roald Dahl Place for the Cardiff-born writer, a place the whole world would come to recognise from television. The Wales Millennium Centre opened in 2004, its great bronze dome and slate walls inscribed with poetry in Welsh and in English, words about horizons singing in the stones. And in 2006, on St David's Day, the Queen opened the Senedd, the home of the Welsh Parliament, on the waterfront where the docks had been. Stop and consider what that means. The single most international place in the history of Britain, the square mile where 50 nations had lived as one, was cleared away so that the home of Welsh national identity could be built upon its grave. The waterfront of a nation rose on the bones of the most cosmopolitan community that nation ever produced. There is a kind of poetry in it. There is also a kind of theft, because the final act of the deal was not the bulldozer or the barrage, it was the name. The developers did not want Tiger Bay. The word carried too much, the vice and the danger, yes, but also the colour and the memory and the people. And so the area was rebranded, cleanly and deliberately, as Cardiff Bay. A petition to the Welsh Parliament would later argue, with real anguish, that the name had been changed because Tiger Bay was seen as too exotic, an attempt to sweep away the diverse communities who had lived there by dismissing them as a slum. You can survive the demolition of your streets, you can rebuild a bombed mosque, but when they take the name, they take the memory, and a place can die a second time in the language alone. And the cruelest detail of all is that the people who remained were not even invited to the wealth that replaced them. The old railway embankment was left standing, a wall of earth that physically separated the poor estate of Butetown from the glittering new waterfront a few yards away. Sir Geoffrey Inkin, the man who built the new bay, was asked late in his life what his greatest disappointment had been. It was that embankment, he said, that wall. A local councillor put it more plainly. The development of Cardiff Bay, he said, never included the people of Butetown. There was a huge divide between the bay and Butetown, and there still is. So what is the verdict? It would be dishonest to give you only one side, because there genuinely are two. For the deal, the case is real. The bay was a wasteland of dereliction and despair, and leaving it to rot was no act of kindness either. The regeneration reclaimed the ruin, drew in vast investment, gave Wales a waterfront capital and a home for its democracy, and an official review judged that it strengthened the whole city's position. Lord Crickhowell, who dreamed it, said near the end of his life that when he felt low, he would go and look at what they had built and think, look what we have done. Against the deal, the case is just as real, and to many it is heavier. A unique and irreplaceable community, more than a century in the making, was displaced and scattered and gentrified out of existence. A protected natural habitat was deliberately drowned. The people who had given the place its soul were walled off from the prosperity built on their land, and their own heritage centre, the keeper of thousands of their photographs and hundreds of hours of their voices, was left without funding and forced to close. And the name they had carried, for better and for worse, for 100 years was simply taken away. One Welsh politician called the whole thing one of the greatest financial scandals of post-war Britain. Perhaps the truest thing to say is this: Tiger Bay was not destroyed by an enemy. It was not taken by war or fire or flood. It was loved, in a way, by the men who decided to replace it, loved as an idea, as a vision of what a waterfront could be. It was simply not loved as it was, with its noise and its mixture and its inconvenient, glorious, complicated humanity. And so it was improved out of existence. But let me leave you with that name I asked you to remember: Billy Boston, the boy born in the Bay to an Irish mother and a Sierra Leonean father, who became the greatest try-scorer British Rugby League has ever known. For most of his long life, despite 571 tries and a place among the immortals of his sport, no rugby league player had ever been thought worthy of a knighthood. Then, in June of 2025, at 90 years of age, Billy Boston was taken to Buckingham Palace, and King Charles laid a sword upon his shoulder, and he rose the first knight in the entire 130-year history of his game. The official tribute called him the boy from Tiger Bay who became a knight. The bay that made him is gone, the streets are gone, the mudflats are drowned, the very name is wiped from the maps. But the people it raised carried it out into the world, in a Bond theme sung in a voice from Bute Street, in 100,000 mourners for a featherweight boxer, in a sword on the shoulder of a 90-year-old man. You can demolish a place, you can rename it, you can build a parliament on its grave and call the silence regeneration. But the memory of who lived there and how they lived, 50 nations under one grey Welsh sky, is harder to bulldoze than they ever imagined. That is the story of Tiger Bay. If it moved you, the Channel is full of other lost worlds like this one, other British cities that rose and fell and were remade beyond recognition. The next one is waiting for you on screen right now.